I didn't have my first smartphone until I came here to Kazakhstan. Writing dissertation requires really deep concentration, right? And we don't come with those skills anymore, right? We have to learn those. You don't read everything, right? You learn how. I tell all of my students from the history of Kazakhstan, go home and tell them what I've been teaching you in the history of Kazakhstan, and then come back and tell me the stories, some grandfather or some uncle or some grandmother telling them, what are they teaching you in that place? We are questioning the motives of some of these great heroes like Kanesare, we're actually saying, well, maybe he wasn't exactly up to what you thought he was up to.
You are only American in this country, teaching Kazakhstan history to Kazakh kids.
We are outsiders teaching the history of Kazakhstan to Kazakhstanis, a big responsibility, frankly.
Assalamu alaikum, құрметті достар. This is PhD Talks. I'm Nursultan Kabulkas, and today we're honored to have my respected colleague, assistant professor in history at Nazarbayev University, Dr. Michael Bechtel. Thanks for coming.
All right, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Dr. Bechtel, our only goal for today, I guess, is to learn more about you, get to know you better. I mean, I have some facts gathered around internet, just quickly to allow our audience to know you better, I guess. Very short, I guess. And feel free to stop me if that's it's not true, I guess.
So everything on the internet's true.
Yeah, first fact, you got your bachelor's in Truman State University.
I did.
You got your PhD from University of Chicago's Department of Near Eastern Language and Civilizations.
That's correct, yeah.
You are expert in Central and East Eurasian empires from the medieval to the modern period.
Well, I'd like to think so.
Okay, awesome. A couple of other things. I mean, it's not really facts, but my, I guess, assumptions that I try to draw from the information, I guess, from the internet. You love traveling, I guess. Is that
well,
true?
I do. I've done a lot of this, and I always think that there's more to do, but I guess when I look back on it, I've been a lot of places.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So from the list of the places you've been at, I guess it's hard to say you don't love traveling.
This is true. Yeah.
And another assumption is that safe to assume that you are only American in this country, teaching Kazakhstan history to Kazakh kids.
Well, there are a small group of us anyway, and I bet we're all at Nazarbayev University. So. No, there are several of us Americans teaching the history of Kazakhstan. This is something we should discuss in some detail, I think.
Yeah, this is really interesting, I guess. Yeah, as I said, I mean, the only goal for today is just to get to know you better, I guess. Right. And this will require to go back to the history of your life, I guess.
In the beginning.
Exactly. So I usually, traditionally in this show, we go chronologically.
All right.
I mean, as far as you're comfortable to go back to your childhood.
All right.
Maybe you can tell me about your childhood, I guess.
All right. Well, I am from the state of Missouri in the United States, right in the middle. Let's see, what would an audience know about Missouri? Well, we'll start with this. Do you know these films, the Jason Bourne books, these films? Yeah. Well, Jason Bourne is from Nixa, Missouri.
I see.
Right? And the reason that the author of those Bourne books chose that region is because it is the population, or was at the time, the population center of the United States. Mm-hmm. Right? So exactly the middle of everything, and also the middle of nowhere. But I'm from a small town in Missouri. The only other thing I guess I could say about it is that it is it's on the very first page of the novel by Jack Kerouac called On the Road. Mm-hmm. Right, that book, his adventure begins in our prison, actually, in this small town. Takes off from there. So I was born in a big family. I have my mother has 5 brothers and sisters. My grandmother, who passed away only last year at the age of 99. Had 6 children. She had something like 18 grandchildren and 26 or 28 great-grandchildren, all of whom she recited the names of every day so that she would remember them. So a big family. I'm the oldest. I have a younger brother and 2 younger sisters, all of them still in the U.S. So, but it was a small town. At the time I was growing up there were about 7,000 people. And I went to a small Catholic high school, probably one of the greatest things that happened to me in my education. I was taught by capable and caring teachers in a small environment that allowed teachers to work closely with students, right? And so I think that was the beginning of my sort of interest in intellectual things.
Right.
I remember in a religion class, right, taught by a nun, a woman who figures large in my sort of, as I get older, looking back in my childhood, she's a major figure.
I see.
But I asked her once because we were studying something, I had no idea what, but I asked her once, I said, "Do Jews go to heaven?" And I remember her saying, "Well, sure, if they're good people." And even at that age, I can remember thinking, I like that answer, but I'm not sure that's the answer she was supposed to give me. Right? That I'm sure that, being a Catholic nun, she was supposed to say something very specific, but maybe not. But anyway, it had an effect on me. So I had to go to a public high school, which I didn't like much. I didn't like high school for a lot of reasons.
I see.
I had a hard time with teenage boys, even when I was one. But going to college wasn't, it's not something that everyone did. And where I grew up, it wasn't necessarily relevant for most of our lives. We needed to go to work, right? This kind of environment. But basically, I went to college because I didn't know what else to do. Right. My parents hadn't gone to college. I had a couple of aunts, a couple of uncles who had gone, but no one was pushing me hard to do this. And frankly, my parents didn't know anything about it. Neither did I. Yeah. But I applied for exactly one university, and I was admitted, knowing nothing about what I was doing. It was a state school, Truman State University. Happened to be a very good school. Right. It was a state university run as though it were a small private university. And it was sort of an experiment for the state. I knew nothing of that when I went there. And there is where I found my direction.
I see. I guess before your, college life, can you remember anything specific from high school maybe that that key turning point, I guess, that allowed you to say that, hey, I'm going to college? Like any effect from teachers or like maybe parents, something like that?
Yeah, definitely. I remember a couple of teachers. I had this literature, creative writing teacher, and I think that the two of us, we didn't get along well, but I think she saw me as this sort of cliche, rural redneck type, and she was this enlightened literary type, and she was determined to make me, get my head out of these sort of shallow books that I love to read and all of this. And she signed me to read a book called The Beans of Egypt, Maine. I have a copy of this book. And it was so totally not my kind of, it was a very, turns out it was a wonderful novel. And, everyone else got to choose the books they were reading for this course, and she didn't allow me to do that. But as it turned out, this book really changed the way that I went from, I think of course, as I look back on it, the meanings of these events have a different shape, but I understand it now as a moment when I first conceived the difference between skills and content, right? That what she was teaching me was not about what this book was about, but how to think about it, right? How to approach the development of a story, how to approach character development, how to interpret, meaning, and that she did this by forcing me to apply what I was doing to the things I thought I loved already to something totally different. And I can remember, obviously, if I remember the title of this book, it was a good moment for me. Another thing that happened was that I was in high school in 1991 during this, the first Gulf War, whatever it was called. And, my awareness of the world beyond my very small one was just beginning at that age. It was not a hotbed of political activism, this small town I was in. So for me, this listening to the radio, I discovered National Public Radio during those years. And beginning to have this, realize that I had enough experience and enough education to make my own judgments about what I heard. And so I can remember this epiphany moment when I was watching Dick Cheney talk about this things that were going on in the Gulf, and realizing that man is lying. And that turns out he was. But this moment of kind of having a bigger sense of the world around me, and being having the skills to do something, to think about it myself. I think that, I'm not sure I would have answered those two things, but I never thought about the question like this before. Right. But immediately those two things come up for me. That those moments in which there's the beginning of this awareness, like self-awareness, right? The awakening of self-awareness, which frankly seems kind of late in a life, by the time you're 17 or something. But that's the nature.
Yeah, I see. All right, I guess now you're deciding to, at that stage of your life, you're deciding to apply to college, right? The other guests that came, they were like kind of international students somewhere abroad, somewhere in the UK, somewhere in the US. I mean, for the American, it's been a while back. I'm not sure if you remember. What was the application process as an American into the American college, I guess? Well,
this is the 1990s. So this would have been, 93, 94 I was applying. There's no online application, right? Everything's handwritten. And I can remember that the way you found out about universities is that you take standardized tests, right? And depending on how well you do on the test, your contact information is shared with universities at different levels. And, I did very well on these standardized tests. Not the best, but well enough to be getting brochures in the mail from universities that I was never going to get into, right? So there was a time of, daydreaming about places like Reed College or even University of Chicago. I never could have gotten into University of Chicago as an undergraduate. Still couldn't. But my mother and I, neither of us knew anything about this. I remember my mother had a box, and she would put all of the college application materials in this box. And occasionally she would sit down at the dining room table and go through all of these, trying to understand, what was reasonable. And of course, big issue for me at that time was money. Right? My parents couldn't pay for university. I had to figure this out. Right. And since I wasn't, the very top percentile in these tests, I wasn't going to get a scholarship. I was not going to get a sports scholarship. I was going to have to figure out how to do this. Right. So for me, the college application process was one of a kind of reaching in the dark. I didn't understand entirely how any of this worked. I didn't really even know, there became this very big obstacle in my mind of, you have to go to a school in the state of Missouri because you're a resident here, and it's going to be much cheaper if I try to go to a private school, which I could never afford, or a out-of-state school. I had to pay, and I couldn't afford it. So that became kind of, location became I don't recommend this to anyone, right? to go about their college like this, their applications like this. But that's really how it was determined. And, I applied to what I thought was a good university. The small town I grew up in was not far from Columbia, Missouri, which is where the big University of Missouri is. And that was too close to home for me, so I didn't even consider it. So I applied for a university that was farther away. And luckily I got in, because it really...
Was it a history major? Did you apply to history?
Oh, no. Again, still not knowing what I was doing, not even knowing really whether or not this was the right path for me. I mean, I didn't come from an environment in which universities expected, and I had no idea how it worked. Right. And no, I actually started out as a psychology major, but taking geology courses because I thought, well, after I had already signed up to be a psychology major, I thought, no, geology, maybe I'll get a job. And I never took any geology courses. I was a psychology major thinking I wanted to be a geology major, but taking history courses. Finally, an advisor, some of the best advice I got, said, what are you doing? Just be a history major. You're good at this. You like it. And that's more important than, this is the way I tell students now. It is better to do well in a major you love, no matter what it is, than to do poorly in a major that you've chosen because you think it's going to get you a job.
Yeah, right.
Right? I mean, if I like half of our majors were once bad computer science majors. Right? Yeah, and along the way they had this moment where they had to make a choice, and turns out they become very good history majors. So for me, this was kind of the way I began, right? Uncertain about what I was doing. I think all undergraduates, well, even maybe it's worse for graduate students, but we all have this sort of what's the term? Imposter syndrome. Like, you're the only one who doesn't know what's going, you're the only one who shouldn't be there. It must've been a mistake. Yeah. Well, I had that as an undergraduate as well. And, I think that I had this until I was inspired by good teachers. I came to love what I did. And once I discovered that loving your study means you do well, and frankly, takes some of the pressure off of how well you do. Right. I mean, if you love what you do, your grades don't seem to matter that much. Yeah. And when they stop mattering, actually, they get really good. So that's part of that beginning for me.
Right. I'm just kind of stepping aside a little bit. I remember in 2009, my first trip ever out of Kazakhstan to my bachelor's degree in Rochester Institute of Technology. I mean, there was a lot of things for me, like culturally, like different, I guess, in the United States. One thing that I remember distinctly, I guess, when I first came to the States, is how much, that love to books, I guess, in Americans. I'm not sure why, I guess, because I remember we had this shuttle from where I live to the campus. And when you take that 20-minute ride, like 90% of the students, like my age students, just reading books. And can you maybe elaborate, do you have any insights on that? Maybe why is that part of culture, I guess, in America, like reading books? I mean, you mentioned several times that you've been reading a lot.
Yeah.
Where does it come from?
Well, here's my professional answer. I think that, the educational systems in the United States are based upon a German tradition, right? And where you learn first by reading, any of my students who are taking my courses right now are thinking, oh my God, isn't that true? Because I make them read a lot. But I think there is this kind of sense that, scholars read, and this is your first step, in the sense that don't talk to us. You're not going to make progress unless you've read the material, right? Read everything. And I have to say, though, you're right that this kind of pervades. Look, as I was growing up, I never would have understood it, except now that I compare it, right? Yeah. And as you say, it's only when you see some extreme otherwise. But, even as I was young, the local libraries would always have summer programs, and I would go and sign up and, read all of the books that were in part of the summer library programs. We would have private time during my elementary years where we could go to the library alone and sit and read. In a sort of prelude to my bookishness, I can remember that as I became like in middle school, junior high school, that I would not go out to, we had this recess time to play. I wouldn't do this. I would go to the library and I would take notes, on the Second World War or something like this. I look back on it now and think, God, what a weird child I was. But this focus on reading is very common. I can remember, these kind of posters they hang up in schools that would just be big capital letters that said "read," period. This was part of. But the causes of that, I'm sure there's other reasons for this, but that our education system really does have a kind of 19th century, early 19th century even, take that German model as it's where much of the acquisition of information is done on one's own, and that your ability to do something with that and to find a mentorship about how to contribute to that body of knowledge is where the guidance from your mentors and scholars comes. That to me is, I'm guessing that must have something to do with it. But, literacy is one of those tools of government that creates good citizens. And, in the US, there has historically been a big focus on how to create active and responsible citizenry, right? And so reading is definitely a part of that.
Yeah, obviously that was 2009. I remember the first iPhone, I guess, came out at that point. And I mean, when I did my graduate, I guess, studies in California, that was 2016 already.
Mm-hmm.
And that a bit shifted, I guess. When you're sitting in the bus, most of the people were just scrolling through Facebook, liking. I mean, what do you think about it? Is that going to somehow affect, I guess, the generations, I guess, upcoming?
Sure. I think it has to do with the ability for like deep concentration. I mean, how many students now have, I would almost call it a handicap, right? That the focus on short, quick, shallow access of information becomes the way that the rest of your life is run. And then, they come to a class like mine where I assign 70 pages of reading to do before next week. Now, a lot of students just clear their calendars for 2 days and read those 70 pages, even though it's excruciatingly difficult for them. By the time they reach their fourth years, they've begun to develop strategies for reading. I mean, that's the trick, is that you don't read everything, right? You learn how to attack something that you can't read so much of. But yet that requires a deeper level of concentration that for most of our time we're not doing. And I really see the effects of it. I didn't have my first smartphone until I came here to Kazakhstan, because you can't operate in this society without a smartphone. But, and even now, many people, my wife and daughter foremost among them, are always frustrated that I don't bring my phone. Where's your phone? I bring it when I need it to call a cab, right? And that's basically the limits of not to sound like some grouchy old curmudgeon about this, right? Because that's the way you always sound when you say these things. But that it does change the way this access to information that isn't sort of refereed information that's, I've heard some people who are in this debate say things like, it's changing the way we are. We don't need to remember things. We can look up anything at any time, right. And that I think it does have a big effect on us. I mean, you think about how much longer it takes now for PhDs to be produced. And, writing, as you well know, writing dissertation requires really deep concentration, right? And we don't come with those skills anymore, right? We have to learn those. And it's hard. Yeah. It is hard work. Even in the classroom, I'm not above embarrassing students who, can't pay attention for more than a few minutes. I see they're like going back to this. And I think that when you're able to concentrate deeply is when you learn to really love the subject of your study, exactly. Right? For humanities, for historians, thinking deeply if you can do 90 minutes, that's quite an accomplishment, no distractions, full focus. That's when things become rewarding. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I always advocate the deep work. I mean, there is even a book, Deep Work. I'm not sure if you
At your recommendation, I have already read it once and I'm on my second round.
I see.
Yeah, it's by Cal Newport, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. It's a great book. I mean, it technically changed my life in grad school. Mm-hmm. Because it was impossible to do research with all that like vibration in your pocket all the time. That's right. And then there's like very good tips, I guess, in the book how to get rid of that and go deeply, I guess, into the research. I really recommend to all the reader, like to all the audience that we have here.
Indeed.
Yeah. So now I guess you are in your psychology major in Truman State University. Mm-hmm. Can you maybe just tell real quick about your student life, I guess, bachelor student life?
Yeah, it was a small university. I think there were less than maybe 6,000 students at this university. And that was right for me. I come from a small place where I knew all of my classmates and, all of my teachers I knew well. And this was that kind of environment. And this is the first time that I had really, I simply didn't know things about how bachelor's degrees worked. I knew nothing, really, like right off the farm, it's what it kind of felt like there. And so during that time, I tried on lots of different versions of myself, like all undergraduates, like all people at 18 to 22 years old, you're trying out something new. You're no longer the child of your parents. You are building up who you are going to be and how you're going to operate in the world. And, luckily for me, there were faculty members there that were open to getting to know me, to becoming friends, to establishing real connections, and who were fantastic teachers. And so, I went to this, the Truman State University with the thought about, okay, I'll get this. I have no idea what I'm going to do after these 4 years, but this is 4 years of not having to worry about it, right? Mm-hmm. I can go be a student a little longer while I have no idea what I'm doing. But that during that time, I began to find that some of the most stimulating moments in my life were happening in a classroom, were happening in a discussion, in an environment in which there was someone in the room who was indeed an expert, but more than that, they were a good teacher. They knew how to foster this interaction between students and to recognize that it takes time for us as students to reach a level of expertise where we can get deeply into a subject and find this kind of, it's like a hum in the room where all of us have gotten past the trying to figure it out stage, and now we're engaged with what do we do with this. And you can't replicate that in every classroom, but occasionally it happens. Mm-hmm. And when it does, it is, I guess the word is addictive, frankly, that you want more of this, that there is something there that is so deeply satisfying. And I began to see that, and I threw myself in every cliche way into being a scholar. I grew my hair long and, wore sandals and read Gandhi's autobiography. And, I really, and I loved it. I embraced it totally. Yeah. And so that sort of set the path for me. And I saw it was the first time in my life that I had what you might call a role model, right? I saw these faculty who were, they were just morons like me who had really found something they loved how to do, right? And became very good at it. And I think that's the first time where I considered, hey, I could do this. It was less about I could do this than I don't want to stop doing this. Yeah. Interesting. So I think that's where my ideas really turned towards even thinking about graduate school, that there was some kind of intellectual life for me.
I see. Even though you said like in the high school, you didn't know exactly what you're going to do, but you had this distinctive features of a scholar. You guys like going in the recess to the library.
Yeah, I didn't recognize it as exactly. That at the time, but yeah.
Well, yeah. Do you think that's the a characteristic of a good scholar to have that like a pure interest into the subject, I guess?
Sort of. In some cases, depends on your personality. I wouldn't consider myself, a scholar in the kind of mold of what others would recognize as scholar. I'm not the best at what I do, right? I like it. I love it. And that's what gives me some kind of, if I'm good at it, it's because I like it, right? It's because I deeply enjoy what I'm doing. But there are better scholars than me, people who are producing far more than I do and who have far better insights into the material. But that's not what I'm doing this for. I do this because I like it. And I think that that enjoyment started earlier than I recognized, right? For others, I see that people who depends on what you study, how you work, that there are natural skills. If you've grown up in an environment in which, there are scholars in your immediate family, you can see it in a different way. My path was different than those who had already an understanding about how the whole academia, how that works. I spent half my time as an undergraduate trying to figure out how to pay for it. First of all, I had several jobs and this sort of thing. I didn't do well my first couple of years. It was an environment I knew nothing about, but many students come already knowing this. And in that case, you can be a very good scholar and it's not such a life-changing event, right? You can be a trained scholar and be very good at this without the kind of deep transformative experience that I needed in order to get me from where I was to being a scholar. And I think this is great, right? When you get into graduate school, you see that there are people from all different pathways that have sort of merged into this, these final stages of making you an expert in your field. And as a teacher in a university classroom, I can see those sort of it's like, like capillaries, you see all of them like coming together in ways, joining up in different ways, and they all have such different stories. So while it is important for someone like me, I needed that transformative experience. I needed some seed of that to make me open, really, to becoming a scholar, that I already had a love of this. And so when I encountered those situations in which my love of this kind of intellectual pursuit was satisfied, then I knew that was a way for me to proceed.
If you don't mind, there was one thing that you mentioned, I guess, quoting you, like just what you said a second ago, I guess, when you got into the, I guess, bachelor's degree, into the college, something you said, I'm 18, 20 years old, I'm no longer a child of my parents. This is also one of those things that I noticed in America, that college students sort of get it completely detached, I guess, from their dependency from their parents, which is not the case, I guess, in Kazakhstan, where bachelor students, parents pay for the bachelor's usually. 90% of the time they pay for that, and then in America it's complete extreme, I guess. What's your I guess take on that? What do you think? Which one is right? There should be some sort of balance, or?
Well, I think for a lot of, I can't speak for them all, but I can certainly speak for myself, is that in my own case, if I was going to do this, I had to do it on my own. My parents couldn't pay for it. They really didn't have any interest in me going to university, right? They didn't see it as contributing to me becoming, what I needed to be. Why don't you go to work, make some money? Right. This is an expensive detour. And so really, I was on my own whether I wanted to be or not. And I do see, I feel like some of the effects of parents being involved in a student's undergraduate education, that's also true in some cases now, not even now, has always been in the US, especially students who go to elite schools, right? Because, students don't get into elite schools on their own, right? Your parents, if you've gotten into an elite school, most cases, your parents have done everything they can, like any parent does, right? You cash in all of your favors. You put all of your resources behind getting the best education that you have access to for your kids, right? And in many cases, that means the parents are very involved in students' lives and their pathways to university. And, as we know, Nazarbayev University is this elite school in Kazakhstan, right? And so, of course, we're going to have some very invested parents in what's going on there. This is a challenge for many students, right? Because many students find themselves studying things that they necessarily wouldn't choose themselves, right? That maybe they would choose a different path, but they're not entirely on their own yet. This same thing happens in the U.S., right? I can remember as a graduate student, I was teaching at University of Chicago, teaching undergraduates. And, University of Chicago is mostly a graduate school. The majority of students there are graduates. Right. There are only some minority. So basically, 18-year-olds are going to graduate school. That's the way it works, right? But I can remember once that I got a message from a parent of a student in my class asking me about a grade I gave this student.
Oh, interesting.
And I can remember thinking, this crosses a line, right? Yeah. That this student is 19, 20 years old, and I'm hearing from his mother, about it. This isn't right,
Was it a Kazakh student by any chance?
No. This was in Chicago. Actually, I've never heard about from parents here, despite the fact that, as you know, as we mentioned in the beginning, I teach the history of Kazakhstan, which is a wonderful sore spot that I love. I love the mid-semester break because I tell all of my students from the history of Kazakhstan, go home and tell them what I've been teaching you in the history of Kazakhstan, and then come back and tell me the stories, some grandfather or some uncle or some grandmother telling them, what are they teaching you in that place? Um, but yeah, the connection between parents and university students is one that I think it's important for students to break that connection, not rebel against their parents, right? That's not what I mean. But, it's a time when great changes are happening in your life. I mean, your university years, I tell my own students, I say, look, the most important things you're going to learn in these 4 years are not going to be learned in the classroom, right? That is not where you're going to become what you're going to be. Mm-hmm. That you're shaping who you are, but the greatest lessons you will learn are going to happen in the discussions between you and your friends, between you and the scholars on this campus in the hallway, mm-hmm. right? Or the experience of having to figure this out yourself. Those are the lessons you take out of here, right?
It's more social, I guess, right? Social interactions, I guess.
That's right, because you're becoming an expert in many ways in a subject. Depending on your major, it may be more like training, or you're expanding your ability to deal with problem solving, the way you think, your awareness of the world. But it's how you apply those things outside of the classroom that matters. And, universities are places where, especially a university in the model of Nazarbayev University, which, it's a whole universe for students. I mean, we literally have a fence around that universe, right? So, what happens on campus is are things that allow students to push their limits, to try anything they want, right? To find out what works for them and what doesn't. Who do they want to be? And to try it out in an environment that not only tolerates it, but encourages it. And during that time, that begins, almost all students begin to find points at which the separation, the adhesive between them and their parents is beginning to weaken, right? And that's not always a bad thing, right? Because in many ways, that is exactly what parents want out of this kind of thing.
Yeah, one thing I found out, in America, I was surprised to hear about the concept of student loans. I guess when that's the student they're completely independent out of their parents, and they're legally getting some loans that they're going to pay
that
back.
They know nothing about. They don't understand how this works.
It might be an issue too, right? But the fact that you're getting that responsibility to pay for your school by your own, I think something very interesting, I guess. You get that responsibility, I guess, right?
That's right. It's a responsibility that, I certainly didn't understand at the time. I took loans. I had to.
Oh, you got some loans?
Yeah, because, it's either that or quit school and go somewhere else. I was working 3 jobs at some times, right? And I was working 3 different kinds of jobs, doing badly in my classes because of it, right? But also having to take loans on top of it all. And that's part of figuring it out that is a real challenge for American students and elsewhere, but yet it's the student loan system that gives a lot of people access to university that they wouldn't have otherwise, right? I wouldn't have, right? And I'm certainly not sorry about that, the way that, student loans, even though, there's a lot of debate about student loans in the U.S. right now for a lot of good reasons. But for me, yes, the whole loan system is predatory and, badly communicated and right now badly managed. But the truth is I wouldn't have had these opportunities without it. Right. And so even though, it turned out I didn't understand what I was getting myself into, I still am not sorry about that. It got me where I am, and I'm happy about that.
That was an experience, I guess, right? Maybe we can stop a little bit on the 3 jobs you worked at during
All right. Well, I worked many jobs, but the 3, working 3 jobs was only possible because of their timing, right? In the mornings, I would go early in the mornings to a lumber yard that is like a building supply, right? I would load trucks. I would unload the shipment of wood and pipe for plumbing and all of this stuff, and sometimes go on deliveries to construction sites. And so I would try to schedule my courses, most of them in the afternoon. So I would go to class in the afternoon where I would, I can remember sitting once in a Japanese class. I failed Japanese so badly because it's the first language I'd ever studied, right? In high school, we had no foreign language, so I had to learn I had to learn better English in order to even go to university. But I can remember sitting there. I had sawdust in my hair. My jeans had oil stains on them. I even had a tool belt still on, and I was sitting there thinking, "What am I doing?
Wow. Yeah.
I don't fit here. This is not the right way to do this." I would take those classes in the afternoon. I had a job at the library. I loved this job. Job at the library. I worked in special collections at the library. And then at night, overnight, I worked as a DJ on the radio station. That is a job that I loved. I have gotten so much mileage out of that job in the time since I had it. Like, even now, it's something I like to talk about, but it was a terrible job at the time. Didn't pay enough. I had to work all night,
Right.
But, so, it was a cycle that was hard to break, but I was so determined not to give up on this thing, right? Because those glimpses of what was possible sort of kept me. But after a couple of years of doing very badly in my courses, I had to figure out, how am I going to do this? Right. So I got basically a full-time job at the library where I worked half-time during the semester, full-time during the summers and the breaks. I was the student curator of our campus historical museum. I loved that. Right. And took loans. I mean, that was the way that I had to figure it out. But what it allowed me to do is that somehow the psychological shift between, loading trucks with building supplies and then going to class and studying medieval history didn't always work. But going from the library to doing medieval history, that basically I lived in this academic environment all the time. And that is when things turned around for me. Mm-hmm. I started doing very well in my courses. It took me 5 years to graduate. So I just want to tell students that, you can be very successful while having to do a fifth year. It works, right? So for me, that was really, it's me trying to figure it out. How do I do this?
Were you part of any, did you have times, for any clubs? Because I was when I was doing my undergrad, I was part of, we had a Kazakh student association. We had a lot of Kazakh, actually, with 80 students studying. Yeah. And I was part of Muslim student association and some, engineering clubs. This kind of three things kind of defines my core values, I guess, right? Were you part of any?
I wasn't. Basically, I sort of operated like we have this phrase, commuter student, like a student who isn't full-time. They, usually they're like older students who live in the suburbs and they come to class, but I sort of lived like this because I was working, I didn't have this full campus university experience until later. And at that time, I wasn't so much into the clubs. I think that I can tell the difference. If I had been a student in a university outside of the US, that too would have been my connection to finding a community there, right? That's how you do it, right? This is how you get connected to people that have common experience and this kind of thing. But for me, I was fortunate enough, even as an undergraduate, to become part of these circles of students and faculty who often had kind of informal meetings outside of the classroom. We would go to a faculty member's home, a couple of times a month, and we would have a performance, or we would review somebody's work, or, this kind of deep intellectual discussion I was talking about earlier. It would happen at these events. We would stay up all night, drinking tea and eating snacks and talking deeply about something, some focus around some particular topic. And, in this way that, Wagner and Nietzsche did, these kinds of intellectual societies. And that to me just fit with this sort of heavy-handed cliche way I was trying to be an intellectual. Yeah. And seeing these things in my life, that was basically is sort of what I did outside of. I tried to play rugby for a while, but I like my teeth. So, even though I enjoyed the game, those guys, they were like playing with gorillas. I decided, okay, I can't do this. Right. But that's sort of the limit of my athletic and club attempts anyway, and as an undergraduate.
So you mentioned about those glimpses of thinking about graduate school. Do you remember exactly when that happened? I mean, did you apply to graduate school immediately after undergrad, or you had some?
I did. When I was an undergraduate, I had a particular faculty member. His name was Michael Davis. He was an anthropologist. And, he was this guy who we sort of had similar backgrounds. He's much older than I, but he was from rural Oklahoma. He had been in the military, but after the military, he had this money. So, he went to graduate school and he was the one who really encouraged me to think about graduate school. I mean, I recognize now, now that I'm in a position to see characteristics of students, I can look back on myself at that time and see that the kinds of things that indicate to me that certain students should be thinking about further study, I had some of those characteristics. I wouldn't have known it then, but he must have seen that, right? That this is something. So I did indeed, and mostly because of his encouragement. And I applied to all kinds of graduate programs. I wasn't sure what I wanted to be, right? I knew the kinds of things I was interested in. So I applied to both anthropology and religious studies programs as an undergraduate. And I got into some very good ones, but I didn't go at that time. I made another choice. So, yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about that choice.
All right, I will. Well, because I took 5 years to graduate, that final year didn't require me to take a full load of courses that met my degree requirements. And because I had these jobs, by this fifth year, I was taking additional jobs because I could handle it. Right. And one of these things I was doing is I was a waiter in a Chinese restaurant.
I see.
And I was waiting tables at this Chinese restaurant with Mr. Min, who was right out of some story about hot-tempered Chinese business owners. He was always shouting in the kitchen. And but I remember him telling me as I was, preparing for this final year, you should take Chinese, study Chinese. I had no interest in that at that time. And his wife taught Chinese at the university. So I thought, all right, fine. I've been studying Latin for 4 years, and that was so hard. I'd studied Old English. And so I thought, all right, fine, I'll sign up for a year of Chinese. I learned more Chinese in the first half of that first semester than I had learned of Latin in 4 years, right? There was something about Chinese something about the wiring in my head. Chinese made so much sense to me, and I loved it. Totally loved it. And my only regret is that I didn't discover that years earlier. But so that the choice I made then at the end of my period is that during the time of studying Chinese, the Chinese teacher said, you should go to China. Go to work in China. Anybody can get a job teaching English in China. This was 1998, right? And I thought, okay, here I am. I'm at this crossroads in my life. I got into these good graduate programs, even a PhD program. Yeah. And I got this job offer to go and teach in China. And I remember thinking that this job offer, if I take this job and not the offers to go to graduate school, it's not going to make me a worse candidate for graduate school in the future, right? And if I go to graduate school now, I'll never have this opportunity in the same way. So I went to China. Nice. And I feel like in many ways that I became who I am now during that time in China. I mean, it was, to me, it's part of kind of a continuum of experience that starts with university and goes to China. In those years, and at the end of the 20th century, I just sound like an old man to say that. There were not a lot of foreigners in China. I mean, there were all these like middle-aged white men who lived in the Ritz-Carlton in Shanghai and were there as consultants to Nokia and whatever, But as 22-year-olds who had enough Chinese to think they were capable of, of operating in China, there weren't many. And so I went to work for a school there, teaching English it was a boarding school. And from like children, 3 years old, all the way through high school. And my job there was to do teacher training. So the Chinese teachers who taught English to the kids were my students. And it was such a great experience in so many ways. I mean, I can't even begin to, the culture shock. There's no way to be prepared for something like that. Right. You just have to go and do it. And it set me more on the course that I'm on now than any other experience in my life. And, I I came back a totally different kind of person at that point.
How many years do you spend in China?
Just over one, somewhere between 1 and 2. And I traveled all over, right? And that's where I ended up as an undergraduate being a history major, but specifically focused on medieval history. And that's all medieval Europe and that. But, in China, because of an interest in medieval Europe and the presence of, certain kinds of, the Chinese, the Mongols on the borderlands, the Ming and the Qing are such a present part of, culture in China today that this is an era they look back to as, if you turn on the television at any time in China, there's a Ming or a Qing dynasty drama going on, but there's so much focus on that, my interest and my knowledge of what's happening on the Western end of Eurasia sort of naturally was, connected to what I was seeing in China. And so I really became quite interested in this at the time. And I made a decision then that, I needed to go back to graduate school. And part of my motivation was the classroom, to teach at university level, to figure out a way to turn my career into something that would allow me to live or to at least visit these places that I had come to love, right? Living in China, one of the things I did was I got a job offer at the end of my time working for the school from a local group of people who work for Nokia. Because I was side job as an interpreter, during this time, and I wasn't a very good interpreter, but they didn't have any others. So, I thought I never have to leave this country. I could just live out the rest of my life here. And, but I decided I need to be higher on the food chain for that, right? I could just be this interpreter for the rest of my life, but I wanted to engage at a different level.
Right. Do you remember any specific moments? I mean, you mentioned a cultural shock. Mm-hmm. Any particular moments, whenever you just came to China? Any specific things you remember?
I can remember the overwhelming, assault on my senses. Right? It's still this is '99. So while we had the internet, it's not like the robust. If there was no YouTube. Or if there was, I didn't know about it. There was no way of seeing. Now we're inundated with images of the world. There's so much of the world that we've already at least seen. Mm-hmm. I hadn't seen any of this stuff. I mean, I went to China with images of straw hats and rice fields, right? I mean, there was just no way for me to be prepared. And everything is different. When I mean everything, I'm talking about the way they lay tiles on the sidewalk, the shape of a garbage can, the sounds that birds make, the kind of hardware that they put on doors. I'm talking about this level of, absolutely every aspect of the world is different. And it is exhausting, right? Because your attention is constantly on the world around you in every detail. This was initially the hardest part. And I liked it, but it was totally just ruinously exhausting. I mean, a day was short. As it turns out, and part of my job later became helping the new arrivals, the new foreign teachers come to the school, going and picking them up, helping, get them past this initial shock. And I could tell within 48 hours if I was going to have them book a flight home, right? Because I think that there are some places in the world where you go from a kind of culture that you're familiar to one that is so totally different. I mean, the world becomes more and more the same, right? I mean, we talked about the traveling. I see so much sameness, but there are still places where you can be so totally overwhelmed with the difference. And China's definitely one of those places for an American, especially one from, the middle of Missouri. And yet what ended up happening is that while many of the aspects of being there were so different, there were some things that were so familiar to me, like surprisingly familiar in ways that I just couldn't have expected. I think about the fact that, eventually when you encounter new people, you look for commonalities, right? You look for common points of connection in order to build a new relationship with someone. And in China, many of those common points didn't exist. So what happens in that case, right? When you're faced with someone, I mean, the best friend I made there was a man who was 30 years older than me. He was a, I say security guard. Basically, he just spent all day drinking tea, sitting on a chair by the front door of my apartment building. He became one of the best friends in my life, right? But we had absolutely nothing in common. And what happens in that is that you throw everything out and you start from the beginning. Mm-hmm. You build a relationship based upon this idea that basically we're just, we're human, right? Let's start there. And I found that I was able to build relationships there that like I'd never experienced before. That it was the people who were studying English, university students who were studying English, who were closer to my age. I had the hardest time, developing good friendships with them. But the people that I really connected to were total people that I had no concept of their lives before I went there.
Interesting. It reminds me of the book Alchemist by Paul Coelho.
I read this
long ago.
Because he was
talking about that language of soul or something. Basically. Interesting. Really interesting.
Well, many of their values came to be values that I had learned in my family growing up. That when I got together, I was often, I wasn't making a lot of money. I was living with Chinese teachers. There weren't a lot of foreigners living this kind of life, and basically I was thrown into a Chinese life. That was great. Yeah. Not living in the Ritz-Carlton in Shanghai, right? And, I would often get invited to their homes, people who were not wealthy, who lived village lives. And once you got past the way things looked, like the surface, I don't mean the way they look, but like the surface differences, family, having dinner together, it was all the same. It was totally familiar to me, familiar in a way that I felt at home. Mm-hmm. I still feel at home, and the times I've been able to go back to China since then, there's a sense of returning home for me. Like it's so comfortable because I became, those parts of me that became who I am today were so connected to that place. And, continue to be, I find the kinds of values and things that people have to be something familiar and comfortable and pleasing.
Right. Yeah, that was quite a bit of experience, I guess. And did you defer your graduate school, I guess, acceptance letters, or
I had no idea such a thing was possible.
I see.
So basically, I just said no.
I see. When did you start thinking back about grad school? I guess.
Immediately, because when I came back to the U.S., I had no plan, and at that time, it's not like I could apply for a job online from China, right? I was just not that way. And, if you're in China and you're trying to apply for jobs, you're impossible to talk to. So you're not someone that. So when I came back from China, I ended up basically doing the worst thing, right? I started just getting these jobs. I went back to a construction job, which was sort of devastating to my sort of idea of myself, because it was available, right? I was working, my father was a manager of this contractor, construction company, and I went to work for them, and I was lucky to have this opportunity. But psychologically, it was like failure, really. Like I had gone to the moon, but then I fell back to earth. I wasn't able to break the gravity. It pulled me back. What I would have been doing right out of high school, right? In the end, I slowly sort of crawled out of this dark period, I guess it could be considered, but getting an office job at a nearby, like a college, a small regional college, and then getting a job in Chicago at Northwestern University, working in administration, and then finally, about something like 7-8 years later, finally taking the GRE, applying to graduate schools, and getting in. Right. So finally, I did this. It wasn't without help. I mean, a lot of friends, would say, "What are you doing? You don't belong here." And that was encouraging to me, but it wasn't enough to get me out of this sort of trap of making enough money to pay the rent and not really having options beyond that, or not really making plans beyond that.
Yeah, applying to grad school as an American is an interesting thing. It's like GRE. You mentioned GRE. I remember like learning all those weird words that I never use now.
That's
like,
right.
How did you do like on your GRE, I guess, in your English test?
Well, actually, I did very well on the English test. Reading.
Right.
That's the thing, right? I mean, during all of this time, my leisurely activities, of course, were very, I guess we could consider them scholarly, right? I mean, I was reading biographies of the great Khans. I was reading histories, and those are the things I like to do with my time, right? And so, I was working these office jobs that were not particularly enjoyable, but it was available, allowed me to live this life of a 20-something in Chicago and go nowhere except, what's happening this weekend. But when I took the GRE, I only took it once, and I did very well. And I take standardized exams pretty well. And, I made a show of studying for the exam, but truth is I didn't really do that much. Right. I got lucky again, I mean, I'm telling the story as if there's all these points where I should consider like some sort of divine intervention, some sort of someone who's saving me from myself in all of these situations. But yeah, I took the GRE just once, and I did well enough that it allowed me to get into these good programs, and shockingly into the University of Chicago. Right.
So did you already know like your research like direction, like when you got into the grad school?
By that time, I did. I mean, I think back to applying to graduate schools as an undergraduate, I wouldn't have been prepared for graduate school. Right. I know that now. Right. I didn't really even know what I wanted to do in graduate school. But by the time that I applied to a graduate program I guess I began graduate program in 2008, I had a much better idea about what I wanted to do. And I also had enough experience in the world to recognize why I wanted to do it. Right. That this was to me it wasn't about, the Mongols, about China. This was about the life I wanted to live. Right. That you think about taking a job, choosing a field of study. Don't think about what you're going to do at work, right? Think about the kind of life you'd like to live. Yeah. Does this contribute to the life you want to live? Because, you're going to bring your work home, but the truth is most of your life is not lived tied to your job, right? I mean, and I recognize that there was a certain value in the subjects I was interested in. If you can talk about Genghis Khan, if you can talk about the Silk Road, if you can talk about gunpowder, you can fill a classroom, right? Because these are things that interest people. Right. I can walk out on the street and say to anyone, do you want to talk about Genghis Khan? And they know what I'm talking about, and they have something to say, right? So this, to me, is an important aspect of the niche I fill in the intellectual world, is that my research and work is not about the Mongol Empire. It's not about China. It is about connecting with people first, right? You do this over the content of your research or your courses, right? But what we're really doing is studying human behavior. What we're really doing is figuring out how a certain group of people did a certain thing, telling a story about this. What we're really doing is figuring out how to draw some lessons out of this enormous, shapeless thing of the past that we don't actually understand and can't, and figuring out why it matters to us now, right? What can I pull out of here that we can do something with? And I recognized by the time I was applying to graduate schools that that's where I could do this well. That, and that came from the kind of casual experience, even in my non-academic life, people recognize me as someone who had, done this kind of, I'd gone off to China. It made you a certain kind of person, not who the hell does this kind of thing, you don't, you're not this kind of. So I leaned into that and filled that expectation and began to own it, that this was something I could do. I could use the things that my experiences, the things that I knew, the things that interested people about me in order to actually do something else, right? So when I went to graduate school, that's really what I focused on. I mean, I like to say to students, why does the Mongol Empire matter? And I'll say, it doesn't, right? That's the first thing. Who cares about Genghis Khan and Ogedei and all these guys? Who cares about this? But why do we do this, right? And then to build up this idea that, we're not looking at them because they have something to say to us. We are taking our ideas and really applying it to their story, or at least the pieces we can get out of their story.
Yeah.
And, it tells us about us, right? I mean, the past is inaccessible, but history is what we make of the past.
Yeah.
Right? We're trying to create a story. The story doesn't tell us about them, it tells us about us. Right. And that's where I feel like is the real joy for me in what I do.
Interesting.
Right. And so when I was applying, I already had these kind of ideas about this. So it allowed me to, submit an application that made it look like I knew what I was talking about. Right. But also recognizing that I needed mentorship. Right. I needed guidance. I was someone who had an idea, but what I really needed was someone to show me the way. Right. And now that I am one of these people who review these applications, boy, that was the right thing to say. But I didn't know it at the time. But of course, that's what you want to hear from potential students, right?
And your travel to China was that a determining factor to study this part of the world, I guess? Yeah, certainly. I mean, I tell students now who are graduating, I say, look, you've got this degree from this university that gets people's attention. Mm-hmm. You haven't complicated your life with owning things or any other connections. Use this to go out in the world and do something. Go get a master's degree in Europe or North America or wherever you can, because this is a chance, right? You are using this thing as a springboard, to get out there. Yes, that master's degree is going to matter to you. But I always say this, apply for a master's degree, but again, it's about your life, right? You're going to live this experience. 2 years is short enough to tolerate any terrible situation you're in if you get there and you find out it's totally horrible. And on the other hand, it's long enough to make connections that you can build on if it turns out that this was a good decision. Yeah. Right? So that's kind of the way I think about this. Yeah. Very, very inspiring, very interesting, I guess.
Yeah, well, you reach a certain point when you can look back on all those things and reorder your life to make the sense of it you want to. I'm a historian. We're retelling this story. Right.
When you once mentioned that you had a road trip across the whole America or something.
Yeah.
When did that happen? Was it during undergrad or the graduate school?
It was a magnificent transition from my life working in jobs that weren't taking me anywhere in graduate school. So once I was admitted into graduate school at the University of Chicago, I quit my office job. Yeah. I took my dog and an old Mercedes-Benz and I traveled, this Route 66. I traveled from Chicago alone, camping, hiking along the way, all the way down to Roswell, New Mexico, where the aliens landed in 1947. I went up the coast of, I went back up into California, to Colorado and Utah, New Mexico, visiting state parks and camping along the way. I drove up the west coast of California, back across Canada, visiting all these wonderful, beautiful places. Yeah. And getting back to Chicago just in time to begin the orientation for my graduate program. And it was like a cleansing trip for me, like wash away these years of pointless, going nowhere and be ready for this next trip. It was great. It was it's something like 16,000 kilometers this whole trip. And I visited 30 national parks and, all the friends that I had in the Western US along the way. And it's quite wonderful.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I have several of these like long expedition kinds of trips in my, I need them occasionally. Yeah. Even my wife starts to say when I get cranky, she'll start to say, well, are you planning your next trip? I always come back improved after this.
Yeah. I guess man needs those kinds.
That's right. You have to go off and I'm I'm very good at going off alone in faraway places, and it's very good for me. I like it when I don't think about things like, there's no self-consciousness. I often realize I haven't even thought about looking in a mirror for 2 weeks. There's no awareness of yourself in these kinds of.
Yeah.
I've walked the Camino de Santiago, which is this medieval, really late antique pilgrimage route in Europe that goes. It's a network of pilgrimage routes that basically meet on the French side of the Pyrenees and go across northern Spain to the Cathedral at Santiago.
Mm-hmm.
And so before I got married, I took a summer and I walked this path. That was a great, sort of the way that a lot of hikers would like to actually walk, because every night there's a place to stay. There are all these monasteries and churches with places to sleep for pilgrims. So you don't have to carry anything. Right? You're just walking all day long with nothing else to think about. You can't get lost. The way is marked. You walk through villages and countryside and cities over mountains. So that was about that's something like close to 2,000 kilometers. I walked there and then I walked back because I had a lot of time. So, yeah.
I mean, what do you think about? I mean, those kind of trips, I guess. I mean, it's impossible to not think about anything, right?
Yeah, it is. Actually, there's on a trip like that, these pilgrimage routes, a lot of people think about, they talk about how you go through 3 stages in this particular kind of pilgrimage route, right? The first is physical, because you cannot prepare. There's no training you can do to prepare yourself to walk every day, all day long, right? I mean, you just can't do that until you're doing it. So once you're out there, the physical changes in your body are quite painful in that first couple of weeks, so your mind is totally distracted with how painful your feet are. But there reaches a point where your body adjusts. And the next point, they say, is very like psychological. You're thinking through your life. You're thinking, because there's nothing else to do, right? You're walking. You can't engage in other activities. You're walking mostly by yourself. And they say that the third part is spiritual, where basically you've spent all this time, day after day, all day long walking, thinking about things. And at some point, you've thought through all the things you want to think about. And now you're present, like in this Buddhist sense of being present. You're aware of yourself and your environment. And that's certainly true. And this is an experience I've had in other kinds of, I like to paddle my canoe and, in Canada, where it's easy to get far away from people in Canada, right? You turn north on any road in Canada and pretty soon there's nobody, there's no road, right? And in those environments, I really like this kind of being totally connected with the task at hand. I can paddle all day long and I realize at the end of the day that I haven't thought of anything except the water, the wind, my boat, the paddle in my hands, the weather, being totally occupied with the kind of task at hand allows something still going on, but it's the break you need to let your mind work things out. So I think that's the part that keeps driving me back to these sort of adventures.
Right. Do you think it's important to be alone in those kind of adventures, I guess?
It is for me. Yeah. I find it really necessary to regularly be alone in a way that I'm totally confident about. So, if you're alone in your office, but somebody might knock on the door at any time, you can't totally engage in this sort of deep reflection. I mean, for me, I've got to go halfway to, from between the Great Lakes and the Hudson Bay to find this kind of connection where I'm absolutely certain that no one's going to surprise me, right? I mean, it's not going to happen, but the way that you think about it. And to me, once I'm in that environment, I'm sort of, yourself sinks into a kind of, just a connection with where you're at. And I like that. I mean, this is something that I have found more and more in my life is important. Right. Sort of resetting the way that I think about things.
Have you watched Croods? Like it's cartoon movie?
No, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, there's a caveman basically meeting a better man, basically like a more evolved person. Apparently, that better man is basically bringing him to his own place. It's basically a sauna. So they're sitting there, and the caveman is asking like, are you hiding from your family in here? And he goes,
why
like,
would you do this?
No, he goes like, no, I'm helping my family here. The best ideas come in this way.
This is true, right? Well, I think this is why, you know, certainly my wife has always supported this kind of, you know, she and I came together when we were adults, you know, and having our own ways of doing things. But she quickly recognized that I'm easier to get along with when I have some regular access to this kind of thing. So yeah, I think it is important. And, you know, look, people who work in this kind of intense intellectual work, you can't always be on. You know, there are a lot of things going on in your head, especially when you're doing a big research project, or for me, the most kind of demanding and stressful intellectual things I deal with are my students, actually, that I get very involved in trying to work things out, you know, trying to figure out how best to meet their needs or to address some problem that students are having. And, you know, in order for me to do this with the clearest way and to give the best advice that, you know, a lot of advice we give is about us, right? We're giving advice to the person on the other side of the desk, but really we're giving ourselves some advice, and that doesn't work, right? And when to be able to give good advice to students who need it, you have to like be open to what they really need. And when my head's full of myself and my work, I don't do that very well. So I find that those are the most demanding things, right? It takes a lot of energy to like see things the way they need you to see it. So you need breaks. Right, you know, you need. I always tell students, when we have a break, take a break. Yeah, right. Yeah. You've got a week. Go do something. Don't think about my course for 7 days. Right. Go away. Come back here refreshed, and you'll be better at this. Or you know, go home for the summer. If you don't have to take summer courses, don't think about this. Yeah. Right. That you'll come back a better student for it. Right. Yeah. Maybe that's advice for me again. I don't know.
So you got this break, I guess, from everything, and then you're starting a grad school, right? I guess let's talk about your research, I guess, just a little bit, because I mean, history research is part of your life now.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to conduct research in history, I guess?
Well, you know, one of the things that's often, I feel like, not understood well outside of the work of historians, and by many historians, I have to say, is that, you know, historians have a lot of, like all fields, a disagreement about like this philosophy of history. What do we do? What is it that we're actually doing when we produce history, right? History is a product. It's not a thing that exists outside of the historian, right? The past exists outside of any of our abilities to interpret it or anything else. The past exists objectively, but we make history, right, using the past, or really remnants of the past, traces of the past that have been left behind. We cannot construct the past, right? We cannot construct a real vision of the past. Any history we do of the past is a very personal version of that story, right? We're storytellers, right? We make up stories, and we make up stories that help us to understand some series of events, some response by human beings to particular circumstances. And we do that in order to explain the present. I mean, that's always the case. I mean, there is no objective history, despite many historians, and in the past, and in our own, and you know, in the development of history, a lot of historians would still argue that there is an objective past and that we can write an objective history, that we can write an unbiased kind of history. But, you know, a lot of historians don't, me included, think that this isn't possible, and that aiming for absolute objectivity is something that we shouldn't engage in, right? That we're writing a very particular kind of interpretation of past events in order to answer particular kinds of questions. So it takes a long time for historians to figure this out. Yeah. I mean, you know, even in graduate school, I didn't understand this exactly. You know, I feel like I was halfway through graduate school before I finally figured out what it is historians do. Right? I mean, if you think about the way we offer history classes, I mean, from the very beginning, from elementary school all the way through graduate school, the titles of those courses are about the content. I mean, you know, right now I'm teaching a course called The Age of the Dragon Throne, right? And this is a course that goes from the Yuan, the Ming, to the Qing, to the end of the Qing dynasty. Well, that's the content, but what I'm really teaching is how you look at this period. What are the kinds of challenges of the materials that are available? What can we pull out of this period? But nobody's going to take a course called, critically, reading critically reading sources, or source criticism, or, using sources to understand the past. I mean, that's not going to fill a classroom, but, the Mongol Empire, that fills a classroom.
Yeah.
But yet, what do historians really do? We have a set of skills that we can apply to anything, really. We choose a particular area about which we do research. So for me, in graduate school, I bounced around all over the place. I wanted to be a historian of what we call big history, of like the long periods, studying 1,000 years at a time. This is kind of the realm of historians of the 19th century. And during the middle of the 20th century, partly as a response to the violence and the ideology, the sort of destructive ideology of the 20th century, many historians turned toward very minutia, looking at very short periods of time, becoming experts in, a 10-year period in a particular region. And we shied away from these big history ideas because it fed into much of totalitarianism, fascism, right? Historians had this kind of moment in the 20th century of reflecting on, are we responsible for this? What is our connection to this? So in order to avoid that, history changed a lot. And, but the pendulum is swinging back, and we're beginning to see more historians focused on big ideas, evolution of people and civilizations, and trying to study humanity's history as if we could really see them from the outside. Right? I like these ideas. Right? I don't think that we can really understand it. It's like going to another planet and observing the life on that planet from afar.
Yeah.
But I like the questions and the ways that we approach these questions. My dissertation was on a 15-year period of the Mongol Empire. So despite my efforts to this otherwise, that, I got good advice as a graduate student that the dissertation is a performance. Don't worry about what you're really accomplishing with your dissertation as far as the field of study. Your dissertation is a performance to show that you know how to do this. You know what the field exists, what composes the field. You know how to use the sources in order to build your arguments and to form your ideas. You understand what historians are saying to one another, and you are able to put these things together in a way that shows your ability to engage in professional intellectual exchange. That is what your dissertation about. Right. It's not about whatever you titled it, right? That it's a performance. So, once I accepted this idea that this was about, it became much easier. And, it's a bit hard, as you would know, to go from your dissertation to shifting your research to you're still trying to do things like a graduate student. You're still trying to write as though you have something to prove, right? That you have to back up and to think, okay, this dissertation and the approval from this committee of experts, the gatekeepers, they have put this stamp on me and said, we vouch for this guy. Yeah. He knows what he's doing, and so accept it. You know what you're doing. Go on. So for me, it was. I still haven't quite exhausted all of the, as you're doing research for dissertation, there are all these tantalizing side roads. You're doing something, you think, oh, this is interesting, but no, I've got to focus on this project. So I still haven't exhausted all of those things, but some of them are fun. I mean, I like, mostly I started out my dissertation as a biography of Ogedei. He's, one of the sons and the sort of successor of Genghis Khan, but his reign is not often focused upon as the main character, right, in his own story. So there was a low hanging fruit there. Basically, is that there's no monograph length work on Ogedei, and for years, my very insightful mentor and advisor said, why don't you write a biography of Ogedei? And he kept telling me this, and I kept saying, I'm not that guy. I don't have those. I don't have that set of skills. I guess it remains to be seen whether I have this set of skills, but at least we got through the dissertation part. Yeah. So my research is really focused on these things. I choose I mean, I still am leaning hard into if the only people that read what I have to say are, the very small handful of other scholars in the world who are looking at Ogedei in this period of time or whatever I'm writing about, then I've missed my mark, right? There is something here that I'm not doing right. My research sort of reflects this belief that I have that we're teachers, right? Even in our research, we are bringing new ideas, and part of what we do is that we have this responsibility to take what we have been given, these skills and these abilities and this training and this enormous use of resources that went into producing us as scholars, to give something that's useful to people, right? And I'm talking about people beyond campus, beyond the library, beyond, JSTOR, that we need to be able to connect what we do and answer this question that, my mentor is always asking is, who cares, right? Why does this matter? And, the answer to that is not usually what people expect. So, I like to do things. One of the things I've been working on is something like the Mongol Empire as a family business, right? Comparing these family business models to Mongol Empire. Well, that may seem frivolous to my very serious colleagues and as professional historians, but to someone who's not a professional historian, this is going to be interesting. What I do with that is make a connection to someone with my work that already opens a door to common ground, right? I can say, here's why this matters to you. This could be interesting for you. This could tell you something about either understanding this period that you must have a passing interest in, or give you some different way of looking at what you already know, which may be, corporate business structure and how it might actually be connected to the way that humans have been structuring, frameworks of rule for centuries. So those are the kinds of things I'm most interested in. My love of all things China means that I'm having a great time teaching my Age of the Dragon Throne course. And the
name you picked, you picked that name, I guess, right?
Oh, of course not. No, are you kidding? I had the course named something like History of History of Eastern Eurasia 2. And one of my students came in and I was telling her about this course, and she said, no one wants to sign up for a course called the History of Central Eurasia 2 or whatever I called it. And she said, you got to get dragons in the title. And I realized, of course, one of the themes I already had in there was this concept of the Dragon Throne. And so she came back a couple of weeks later. And I said, what do you think about these titles? And so no, it's all to her. She saved me from saying I have a boring sounding course. Right. So now it's a sexy sounding course that I've realized that I have to deliver on the promise of this cool sounding course in the classroom every week. So
yeah. A little bit of technical, I guess, aspects, still as a person, as an engineer, I guess, who doesn't. Shame on me, I don't know much about history. So there is archaeology, anthropology, and history. And for the person who doesn't know the field or domain, where do you draw that exact line, I guess, between the fields?
Well, this is an argument that we still haven't worked out where we're stepping on each other's toes here. Yeah. But they are connected, right? They're connected in ways that are, we can't really untie these, right? I got my graduate degree in an area studies, right, in Near Eastern languages and civilizations. And so my colleagues were historians, they were philologists, they were archaeologists, they were anthropologists. So we're all colleagues in an area studies program, but each of us are focusing on a particular kind of approach, to our study. So when you ask me a question like this, I say that we cannot be separated, right? If you think about, for me, I'm a historian, I think about traces of the past, like remnants of the past as like evidence, right? And these can be anything. It's not just text, right? We work mostly with text. That's where we focus most of our expertise, is understanding text. But we also use the sources that are provided by and interpreted by archaeologists, right? You can't study, for example, the capital of the Mongol Empire, Karakorum, without understanding the work of archaeologists. So this overlap is important. An archaeologist can't completely understand what they're unearthing in these places without an understanding of the text, the history of this place, right? So we work closely together. Anthropology, this is for me, I at first wasn't sure whether I was an anthropologist or a historian. And frankly, when I was, in my 20s, I wasn't sure of the difference either, except I like the sound of anthropology better than historian. But so there are clear overlaps in this. For example, we have a PhD program at Nazarbayev University in Eurasian studies, right? It's in area studies. So we work together with anthropologists and archaeologists and linguists, and historians, political scientists, because it is in area studies where these things, we can comfortably ignore really the divisions between those. So, one of the things that happens in these fields, particularly in history, is that you cannot be simply a historian, right? You take, for example, you're going to do a history of the Mongol Empire. Well, you have to have a lot of other skills as well. You may need to know something about economics in order to do an economic history of, say, the 20th century China.
Yeah.
One of my graduate school colleagues, he wrote a very great dissertation about astronomy in the Timurid period, right? Well, guess what? He had his undergraduate and a graduate degree in astronomy, right? One of the students that I'm working with now, she's a math major, right? She wants to do a history of particular kind of ideas in mathematics. So historians need these auxiliary skills, these auxiliary expertise, right? For example, my mentor is always focused on numismatics, the study of coins, right? Coins as sources. And this requires things like understanding metallurgy, mining technologies, right? If you're one of my longtime interests is gunpowder weapons. Yeah. Well, you understand the chemistry of this, the processing. How do you get from saltpeter to making gunpowder, right? So as a historian, you have to think broadly about these, and anthropologists and archaeologists have to work in the same way. So we have so much in common that our refuge for being able to work together without territoriality is these area studies in particular. I have a colleague who is an anthropologist, and he is proposing this idea of an institute for the study of pastoralism, right? As an idea of a way that humans have engaged with certain kinds of environments. Well, this is very broad, right? You need lots of people involved in this, lots of different kinds of expertises. One of the things that's becoming more popular now, thanks to certain developments in the way we can understand climate, past climate, is connecting climate change to historical periods, right? More recent historical periods, that not ancient historic periods, but looking even at the role of climate in the, rise of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Confederation. Is there a connection, right? Is there a climate change that would have made them stronger or to force them into this kind of expansion? And we're finding all kinds of interesting ways. But of course, that requires us to work with climate scientists, right? And to be able to, what they learn from us about the reports of, we're reading texts about certain phenomena that are being explained, right? I know some of these graduate students from my time at University of Chicago, they are historians, they work for NASA, right? And they're looking at, their expertise is to read sources about, astronomical events, reports of things that were witnessed, and connecting them to ways of understanding movement and timing of comets, for example. So, when you're a historian, you have to be open to this kind of flexibility, because again, it's the study of human behavior. And that means that you cannot narrowly look at any particular time period or ignore the other aspects to the way we study human behavior. Right?
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, one of the things I was curious about, we here in Kazakhstan, I guess, especially in the school, when we take like history of Kazakhstan, when we studied Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan is portrayed as some, I guess, positive figure. I mean, as you said, there is no, I guess, objective history, right? Because we live in this region, and most of our Khans were, I guess, his descendants, right? I'm curious, like, what is the, I guess, the Western world? How does Genghis Khan is viewed? I mean, if you look at Genghis Khan, I mean, he just destroyed everything. He like burned the libraries and stuff. Right? I mean, does the world, like a Western world, sees Genghis Khan as a maybe negative figure, like?
Well, there must be a bit of a grade from Central and Eastern Eurasia towards Europe till you get to Western Europe. If you're far enough away in Europe that your region wasn't affected by Genghis Khan, you can look at this guy more objectively. But if you're Hungarian or you live in Vienna, maybe you look at the Mongols with a bit more critical eye about this. But in my experience, certainly in say North America, Genghis Khan is there's no investment of your own identity in Genghis Khan and what the Mongols did and their impact, right? I mean, there's this long idea of the Tatar yoke, we call it in Russian history, that, look what the Mongols did to us, this kind of. So one of the things about doing this Mongol thing is that for me, my experience and exposure to Genghis Khan was basically pop culture, History Channel, Discovery, documentaries that I'm now very very critical of in some cases. But in this environment, you look at it kind of, there's a remove, right? You can examine this event and this person without there being any cost to the identity of yourself or to your there's no cultural connection. But in doing it, teaching about Genghis Khan in Kazakhstan, totally different experience, right? I mean, one of the things that I know is that no matter what I say about Genghis Khan, I have an interested audience, first of all, right? That makes it easy. Right? When you put up a course like the Mongol Empire, everyone wants to take it. But I think that what we do, you brought up teaching the history of Kazakhstan, and I guess this connects back. We did mention this at the beginning. So, we teach the history of Kazakhstan at Nazarbayev University, and not all, but almost all of the teachers who do so are not Kazakhstani, right? And, we get, of course, understandably, a lot of scrutiny about this, right? I mean, first of all, when students go home and tell their parents, an American is teaching my history of Kazakhstan course, they say, how is this possible? What could he possibly know about the history of Kazakhstan? And, and then when we find out that we are questioning the motives of some of these great heroes like Kanesare, we're actually saying, well, maybe he wasn't exactly up to what you thought he was up to. That sort of pushes many of them over the edge.
Right.
What? This isn't right. But, there is an aspect to this that I think is quite useful. And many students by the end of the course appreciate the idea that what we're able to do, we are outsiders teaching the history of Kazakhstan to Kazakhstanis, a big responsibility, frankly. But what we bring to this is a kind of remove from the subject, right? Our identity is not tied up with the history of Kazakhstan in the same way that those who are Kazakhstani and particularly Kazakh are, right? That we are able to bring a kind of, again, it's not objective, but, a kind of professional remove to this. And we teach the history of Kazakhstan in a way that very specifically, doesn't tell students what to think about the history of Kazakhstan. In fact, frustratingly for many students, we won't tell them what it means. How am I supposed to understand this? We give them the sources. In most cases, students have never read the letters of Kanesare, the letters that he wrote himself, that they've never seen this. They've never seen the account of Abulkhair Khan's meeting with Tevkilev. They've never read this before, right? And what this allows them to do is to say, okay, here is what we know. This is actually the source of everything you know about this. This is where this is the source of it. Read it yourself what do you think about this, right? And try to give them the tools so that they feel confident interpreting meaning out of these sources. That is really what we're doing with the history of Kazakhstan, right? And the history of Kazakhstan allows this kind of common ground, right? We have a subject that not all of our students are Kazakhstani, but many are.
Yeah.
And even if they're not, everyone at the university, in Nazarbayev University, has a vested interest in the history of Kazakhstan because here they are, right? And how they understand the history of this place, whether they're only here for 4 years or not, it matters to them.
Yeah.
So giving them to interpret and decide for themselves how to understand this past is important to forming a kind of citizenry, or at least even as we send these students out into the world, their connection to Kazakhstan is, whether they're Kazakhstani or not, is firm, right? They went to school here, and how they understand the past here is important. What does it mean? How did we get to be where we are today? And we teach at Nazarbayev University. This university becomes every year more consequential, right? I mean, I like to tell my students that we are absolutely certain that somewhere on this campus is a future president of Kazakhstan, right? I mean, this is the
probability is pretty high.
Yeah, the probability is pretty high. So how they think about what it means to be Kazakhstani has real world implications, right? What does it mean? How do we interpret this story we're telling about ourselves? I use this word myth, not in the sense of a fake story, but in the idea of how we tell the story of our origins. Kazakhstan's just barely 3 decades old as an independent nation.
Right.
We're still trying to decide, what is our mythology? What is the origin of the story we want to tell about ourselves, not only for our own benefit, but what do we want others to know about us? And, I think about how in my life, I'm not going to change the world, but the people in my classroom can, right? So if I can give them some tool to be able to understand things more clearly, or to be able to think about using this past of Kazakhstan to build a better Kazakhstan, then that's what we're doing, right? So in the end, even though we don't start back with this period of the Batars, or, we basically start with Genghis Khan. And I firmly say Genghis Khan was not a Kazakh, right? That we build off of there. Not everyone likes to hear these things, but that we're giving this generation of nation builders these tools that's going to be consequential to them and to the rest of us, right? I mean, they're the decision makers for the future. I mean, this is the first generation of independent Kazakhstanis, right? Yeah. They don't have this connection to the past that their parents and grandparents do. So that is why I feel like it's such a responsibility, and why I feel like teaching it in the way we do has kinds of advantages and important, there are important characteristics of teaching it this way, right? Where it's not a nationalist project. It is tools to build the future.
Sometimes I think that analyzing history is no different than trying to predict the future.
Oh, I like this idea. Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, if you're predicting our future, you just look at the data, you look at the trends, and you try to predict what's going to happen, right? And same thing, if you look at the back, you look at the archaeological evidence, and then you try to figure out what happened, right?
Yeah, I see those parallels there. And you're right. I mean, in some ways, what we're trying to do is, one of the things to think about is that we're like investigators, right? Detectives, right? We've arrived at the scene of a crime. There's broken glass. Your jewelry is missing. What's their job? Their job is like, Sherlock Holmes. You put together a story. You make up a story that accounts for all of the pieces of evidence, connects pieces of evidence in a way, in a narrative that tells us something about what might have happened here that can then inform us what we do next. Yeah. Right? I mean, if a baseball broke the window and you misplaced your jewelry, well, perhaps we can understand that, but the obvious story when you arrive looks different. Someone broke in the window and stole your jewelry. But that part of what we're doing is try to interpret the meanings of evidence And that's not the past, right? That thing exists out there, but we're taking these little remnants, these little pieces, and like weaving them together in a narrative. And we use narrative, like, a beginning, a middle, and end, major characters, all of this stuff when we when we do history, because this is the way we understand stories with one another.
Right. So is that a tool? I mean, if we get a bit into the technical, I guess you mentioned several times you provide tools to the students, right?
Yeah, this is one of the ways, right? One of the things that, particularly with undergraduates, is that you first of all have to make them see that history is told as a narrative, right? I mean, life doesn't unfold as a story. Right? I mean, we don't live life as though we're in a story where there's a build up to a climax and something happens and then the story's over. Yeah. What we're doing is pulling together pieces, evidence of, and we're tying it together to make a story about a particular thing in the past, an event, series of events, or an outcome that we're trying to understand. But the way we put it together, I mean, it's a choice, right? I mean, historians put together a story of the narrative, but ultimately you're making sense of the past, and one of the ways that we humans understand the world around us is to make stories about it, right? And so using narrative as the structure of history, it's really hard to. There are no close seconds alternatives to this, right? This is the way we accept it. So yeah, definitely one of these tools. And the first thing is to take it apart, right? Especially for undergraduates who they know that history is narrative, but they've never really applied this idea that it's a choice of the historian to make it narrative. It is a method. It is a skill. It is a tool that, sure, you can read it and see the narrative, but if you're trying to create history, writing it as a narrative is a challenge, right? And that's part of the way you train historians. Though, again, my job is not training historians. You know how many historians, undergraduate history majors, are going to become historians? Very few, right? So we don't think about it that way.
I mean, what do you think about, you mentioned about teaching approach, in the university level, but how early we can start, teaching those? Because my experience in high school, history classes were all about date crunching.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Memorize these days. When I give you the exam, just write them all back down. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why I didn't got so much interest in history, because
this is true.
It didn't ignite my interest.
I always
early in high school. But this kind of methodology teaching, how early we can start teaching those things to the kids. Can we maybe bring it to high school level, like a program?
I think you could do it very early. Look, my daughter's 6, and as the daughter of a historian, we talk about the past, and she likes to play this game where, on her own, this concept of time, she realizes that everything is the past. She'll say, "Oh, that, I just said that in the past. Oh, I said that in the past," right? It's all the past, right? And she understands that the present, in very practical ways, doesn't exist, right? And that everything is the past, and therefore it is an object for study. Yeah. Right. That we can take this thing and we can shape it. And even though there are these things that happened when we explained what happened, we're shaping it, we're making choices about it. Right.
Exactly.
And what I've seen is that there are varied experiences in the classroom. Most students, all students, anywhere on the planet have a similar experience, right? That history was not interesting. My job was to open my head. They poured in the information. I closed it. When they took the exam, I poured it back out onto the exam, and then I forgot about it. Right.
Yep.
This is pretty common, but especially in our environment, I see a lot of the students who have come from Nazarbayev intellectual schools having a slightly different experience. Many of them, not all of them, but depending on who their teachers were, have already been exposed to this idea that our history is up for discussion, right? That we can actually revisit don't believe what you've been told, right? There, I can reinterpret this based upon my further learning. Look, even within our own work, historians changing their stories all the time about the same thing. The past is always changing, right? The past is never the same. And,
right.
If it was, we wouldn't have anything more to talk about Genghis Khan. How many books can we write about this guy, right? But the fact is that we're always asking different questions. We're looking for different answers. We're rearranging things to tell a new story. That can be done at any time, right? In fact, students in many ways are already learning this very young. It's just not being applied to history necessarily, right? I mean, if you think about, we use many things that seem similar to the way we teach science. We're looking at, we have a hypothesis, right? And we're saying, here's something, we're trying to answer this question, right? Were the contributing factors to a particular set of events 1, 2, and 3, right? Well, how do I find out? I go back to the sources and I examine them. So these are the things that I think we can do this, that's no problem. We approach literature in ways that allow us to, we're always interpreting the meanings of certain characters. What does this story tell us about a particular time and place of the author? Or how do we interpret the meaning of this story as a moral thing and all of these, right? So why not history, right? We can do that.
Right. I think it's time to wrap up, Professor. It was very interesting, inspiring, conversation, I think. Thank you so much. I guess finally, last question, I guess, that I usually ask guests. What is your favorite book that I would suggest reading to our audience? And whoever comments, I want this book, I'll try to basically make a kind of raffle and randomly select.
All right. There is a book that had one of the biggest impacts on shaping my ideas about how to do scholarship, right? And it's a book that is a pleasure to read as well. It's written in a wonderful way by a man who was a great scholar, a religious scholar, actually. His name is Huston Smith. And he wrote a book in the 1950s, at that time titled The Religions of Man. But now it's been, of course, for the last 30, 40 years, retitled The World's Religions. And this is a look at religious practice in a kind of comparative and accessible way. I mean, he was a man who, he was American, but he grew up in China as a child of missionaries. He traveled all over the world. And, in the 1950s, no one was doing this kind of thing. He taught on television, on public television in the 1950s, which no one was doing. But this book, and my experience with it came at the right time in my life and as an undergraduate, I still go back and read this book constantly. I've been through several copies, wearing them out and falling apart. But it is a pleasure to read, and it explains so much, helps you to understand so much about what religion is and isn't, and how we can, we take Confucianism and, Christianity. How are those two things related? And it is one of those things that you can read. You can open the book in any place. It's like having someone in the room telling you a wonderful story. But yet it is one of those things that can only be written by someone who has experience in the world and who is a sensitive and open author, right? He was a great scholar, but he's also an insightful person. And I always recommend this particular book.
So it's Huston Smith, and the book name is Pleasure to Read. Is that the name?
No. I'm saying it's a pleasure to read. No, the book's title is a particularly uninspiring. The World's Religions.
Oh, I see.
It's just called The World's Religions, right? But this is one that I think holds many insightful views into understanding our connections. Right. The big picture.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. I think I got a small present for you. Is it okay? Pass it to me.
Listening to me talk endlessly for this long wasn't a gift enough that you.
It was a gift. I guess this is a small present for you from the project.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate this. Quite enjoyable. Yeah. All right.
Awesome. Yeah. How is it, Sandra? Good?
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are fun things to do. You ask good questions. You're good at this. Yeah.
I think, on my side, it's easy, I guess, to just ask and listen.
Yeah, but you're good at following the trail, pulling on the string. Yeah.
Reminds the Freeman's podcast, especially when it was about traveling alone.
Yeah.
He was asking at the middle of the technical question, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's right. It's doing this kind of switching back and forth. Yeah. Well, interviews like that help to make connections that wouldn't necessarily come up if you had, categories of questions that you moved from one to the next.
Coming back to that deep like thinking topic, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like conversations lost that sort of depth into them in the modern world.
I agree. I think that
you always have your phone, like people watching the
yeah.
phone. But this kind of like settings when you talk and you just
it's semi-formal where you have some
exactly, you just let the person talk and then you think about it and then maybe try to go deeper. I really like a podcast format for conversation. I wish all the conversation were like this.
Do you know, I think in the sort of Russian speaking world, these long format interviews are quite common, right? I mean, elsewhere, you know, if you want to see like an interview with a scholar or politician or celebrity, they're like, 10 minutes.
Right.
But this very long format, everywhere in this sort of Russian speaking world, in China too, they do this, even on television, you see these interviews, these talk shows, and they talk for a long time. There are a couple of them that are very popular in the US, but in general, they're not that common. So, but I think it's a good way to kind of explore the ideas because, of course, I mean, yes, the podcast is supposed to be about me, but ultimately that's not really what it's about. We're basically kind of having conceptual conversations, right?
Yeah, that was awesome.
Thank you for that.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.